Um, Last time we were about to finish William Blake, and I'll try to wrap him up. It's not because I want to wrap him up, but because, of course, we have miles to go before we sleep, and Time's Winged Chariot and all that. To quote a couple of not romantic poems, but poems you may know. There were three brief lyrics left from the Songs of Experience that we need to look at. One of the greatest of the Songs of Experience is on page 75, and that is the poem London. Blake obviously feels that the fallen imagination, the experienced imagination, that ends up producing so much repression, so much fear, so much alienation, so much conflict, so many questions that can't be answered, and so forth. When you put all of the experienced imaginations together, what do you get? You get what might be called experienced society. That is to say, you get the world that we create with our experienced imagination. And it's not a very pretty picture. I remind you that when he talked about the state of innocence, what kind of imagery, what kind of genre in literature did he constantly refer to? Pastoral, right, exactly. Shepherds and countryside and rustic pens and trees that are like umbrellas that comfort, and how beautiful the lambs and the meadows and the trees are. Here you would almost expect this, wouldn't you? We have left the garden of innocence, and when we enter the world of experience, it is to a very large degree a kind of industrial and city landscape. You'll remember how the tiger, for instance, is described very much in terms of what? Being made in a factory. And what the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain. And so here, we would almost expect that London would end up being the sort of city of dreadful night, the city of fallen imagination or experienced imagination. And sure enough, it is. I wander through each chartered street. Charter means basically license, meaning that you have to have a charter or you have to have a legal contract to allow you to do anything. And the city has become a place, in other words, where if you don't have paper to allow you to do thus and so, then you can't do anything. And so what is the significance of that? What is the world of experience? It is a world where everything is controlled, where everything is repressed, where everything is sort of done by law and order as opposed to spontaneity and love. Near where the chartered Thames does flow. That's particularly ironic because you think of a river in all of its flowing as one of the freest things, but even the Thames has been, as it were, franchised. It's been controlled by legal order. And marked in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. As he travels through the city of London, all he sees are the sort of dehumanized citizens who, living in this sort of dark night of the soul in this modern city with all the restrictions and laws and all the rest, they have become dehumanized. He sees everywhere marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, that is laws, restrictions, everything is controlled by this sort of Eurozenic fallen imagination. You see, the Eurozenic or fallen imagination always tries to control everything because it's afraid of everything. It's afraid somehow life is going to break out somewhere. I'm always reminded of that sort of hilarious definition of a Puritan. You know what a Puritan is. He is a person who is kept awake at night by the horrible possibility that somebody, somewhere, is having a good time. The Eurozenic mind is basically the same. It is so afraid of real life. It is so afraid of spontaneity. It is so afraid of creativity, whether sexual or imaginative or any other kind, that it has to control everything. And so what it's done here is produce a kind of city of restriction. And we have every man, every infant, every boy, every man. And what do we see in all of them? The mind-forged manacles I hear. Manacles are, of course, chains. And Blake's view is we make the chains for ourselves. We chain ourselves down by the restrictions of our own imagination. Now, what are the victims of this hellish sort of city of the fallen imagination or of experience? how the chimney sweepers cry every blackening church appalls. The church, which should protect children, in fact employs children to clean its chimneys. And what does that do? It blackens the church. At the same time, the church is being, quote, cleansed or made clean. So the individual, here the child, the chimney sweeper, is being exploited by one of the institutions of the fallen society that Blake is describing. But he's not the only one, is he, the little chimney sweeper? And the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. That is terrible. It's a terribly powerful but also terrifying sort of line. You notice a very brilliant use here of what's called synesthesia. That is, does anyone know what I mean by synesthesia? Literary technique there. It's where you confuse the senses on purpose. And here you have a very good example, one of the best examples I know in English. And that is, and the hapless soldier's sigh. A sigh is something you hear, but suddenly what does that sigh become? It runs in blood down palace walls, which is something you can see. The point, though, of that sort of brilliantly synesthesia passage is that the soldier is made to suffer for the palace, just as the chimney sweeper ends up being having to suffer under the sort of restrictions of the church. What you're seeing all the way through, of course, if you'll think about it, is the individual is being sacrificed for an institutional sort of agenda, whether it's the chimney sweeper for the church or the soldier for the palace. And then finally, what's the most common institution of all, perhaps? But most through midnight streets I hear. Notice, midnight streets. Is he just talking about a time of day? Of course not. Just as the imagery of light and joy and beauty was everywhere in the Songs of Innocence, what do we have here? We have a tiger that is burning bright in the forests of the night. And so too here. What kind of city is this? It is a city of the night. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse. I remember telling you about the thousands of prostitutes that inhabited London in the 19th century, in the late 18th century. And what does the harlot's curse do? It blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Well, there's a powerful last four lines, isn't it? This is a third institution. We've already seen the church and the state. We now have marriage. You may not think of marriage as an institution, but that's precisely what it is, isn't it? We always say marriage is I used to have a friend who said, marriage is a very fine institution, but who wants to be in an institution? Well, that's exactly what Blake is suggesting. When there is marriage that institutionalized, which means what? Controls, puts restrictions on. After all, you get married, what do you have to get? A charter. We call it a marriage license. Do you notice the wonderful irony of that word license? The word literally means freedom. But if you have to go get a piece of paper for which you pay and the state controls it, it is in fact not licensed at all, but it's chartered, isn't it? It's a restriction. It's a paper that controls. And he's saying marriage is basically a kind of Eurozenic control, a kind of attempt to imprison passion. And when you imprison passion, what happens? It breaks out. It breaks out into the harlots, but then before, you remember, O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night. When love is put under restriction and then has to go underground, then you get all the harlots, but then what happens? Sickness too. What does he mean by how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tears? What happens when you have love that is restricted within institutional grounds, and then it finds outlets that are not particularly healthy or salubrious, and then what happens then? Well, you get what we call today sexually transmitted diseases and so on. And of course, one of the most obvious of those in Blake's time was syphilis, and what's one of the clearest signs that you passed on syphilis to a child? The child is born with an eye problem, with inflammation and damage sometimes to the eye. Blast the newborn infant's tears, is his point. In other words, he's saying here again what he says all the way through. The Eurozenic mind, the restrictive mind, the experienced mind, tries to control everything. And in its effort to try to control everything, what does it do? It produces in-laws and outlaws. It produces urogenic structures that try to repress all of the powerful energies of life. And when it does, it basically ends up oppressing, whether it's the church using the chimney sweep, or the palace using the soldier, or here the institution of marriage, both abusing the exploited harlot and also the innocent child who is born. And then finally, what does all that do? It blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Why is marriage hearse good? Marriage hearse, folks, if you're not paying attention to phrases like that, Lordy, what help do we have? A hearse, you know what a hearse is, I trust. That's what they take you away to your own grave in, right? You know, it's the undertaker's wagon. So what is marriage here? The marriage hearse. It's death. It's a kind of living death, and that's exactly because for Blake, marriage in the late 18th, early 19th century was simply a kind of institutionalized legal agreement that had nothing to do with love, nothing to do with passion, nothing to do with anything. I remind you again that William Blake was, roughly speaking, Jane Austen's contemporary. And if you look at the way marriage is treated in Jane Austen, you will know very well that to a very large degree what Blake says here is pretty much the case. I don't think I need to say much about infant sorrow. Obviously, throughout the Songs of Innocence, children are seen as symbols of joy, spontaneity, and love, and unity. Here, this child, being born into the world of experience, is obviously worried. And he is being born not only into a world of experience, but he is being born into a world where he must be a kind of alien being. He says, my mother groaned, my father wept. Boy, so much for the joys of having a child, right? I mean, they both his parents see him as a problem. Into the dangerous world I left. So this child does not come into a world where everything's joyful. It is not the little children 2 and 2 with their angelic faces and so forth, but it is a world that is dangerous, helpless, naked, piping loud like a fiend hid in a cloud. And obviously a fiend is a kind of demonic figure, someone who's cast out from paradise. So the child coming into the world feels already a sense of alienation, a sense of bitterness, a sense of not belonging. Struggling in my father's hands, striving against my swaddling band. Notice how often in the Songs of Experience you see images of imprisonment, being enchained, being restricted, being tied down. Here, struggling in my father's hands, essentially struggling against his father's control, striving against my swaddling bands. Swaddling bands were made like swaddling clothes in the Old Testament, New Testament, were basically very tight sort of claws that were wrapped around the child to keep it from moving about too much, and they were used for a long, long time. Here they become symbolic, don't they, of a kind of restriction, a kind of imprisonment again. Bound, notice, bound and weary. It's like the first thing the child experiences when he comes into the world is restriction, is imprisonment, is being enchained. Bound and weary, I thought best to sulk upon my mother's breast. The child might as well get used to restriction and imprisonment and being chained down, because that's pretty much in the world of experience what it's all about.